1933. A quarter of Americans are out of work. There is no unemployment check, no food stamps, no safety net of any kind. So Americans do what they have to do. They skirt the law. Most of these 19 things would get you in big trouble today. Before we begin, hit the subscribe button for more deep dives into our nation's history. By 1934, Prohibition had ended. But ending Prohibition did not mean Americans could suddenly distill their own liquor at home. Federal law still required a license to produce spirits, and that license cost more than most Depression-era families earned in a year. So many people ignored it entirely. In the hollows of Appalachia, in the basements of Chicago tenements, in the barns of rural Georgia, Americans ran copper stills and produced corn whiskey by the gallon. The product had no label, no tax stamp, and no government involvement of any kind. It sold for a fraction of what licensed liquor cost because there was no overhead beyond corn, water, sugar, and copper tubing. The operation was not considered shameful. It was considered practical. A man with a working still in 1934 had a business. He had customers, a product, and cash income at a time when cash income was almost impossible to find through legitimate channels. Neighbors bought from him. Local establishments bought from him. In some communities, the moonshiner was one of the only sources of reliable income for an entire extended family network. The federal government estimated that by the mid-1930s, illegal home distilling accounted for a significant share of all spirits consumed in the United States. Revenue agents raided operations constantly. Most moonshiners simply moved the still, waited a few weeks, and started again. Today, producing spirits at home without a federal distilled spirits permit is a federal crime, punishable by up to 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. The permit itself requires a licensed facility, inspections, bonding, and compliance with state regulations that vary by jurisdiction. What Depression-era Americans did casually in their barns is now one of the most heavily regulated activities in the country. In 1933, a dairy farmer named Earl Watson in rural Ohio loads glass bottles of fresh milk onto a wagon every morning and delivers them directly to families in the surrounding area. The milk is unpasteurized. It has not been inspected. It carries no government certification. It is simply milk, fresh from the cow that morning, sold directly to the people who will drink it before the day is out. Earl does not need a permit for this. He does not need a licensed facility, a refrigerated vehicle, or a certified testing process. He needs a cow, bottles, and customers willing to pay 20 cents a quart for milk that tastes better than anything they have ever bought from a store. Raw milk sales are the primary income source for thousands of small dairy farmers across America during the Depression. The economics are simple. Pasteurization requires equipment most small farmers cannot afford, and skipping it means lower costs, higher margins, and a product that customers prefer. The farmer keeps more money. The customer pays less. Everyone understands the arrangement. Today, selling raw milk across state lines is a federal crime. Within states, regulations vary wildly. Some states permit direct farm sales with strict testing requirements. Others ban raw milk sales entirely. Delivering unpasteurized milk door-to-door to residential customers the way Earl Watson did in Ohio in 1933 is illegal in most of the United States and carries significant fines and potential criminal charges in states where raw milk is prohibited entirely. In 1933, a woman named Clara Briggs sets up a table outside her house in Birmingham, Alabama, and sells plates of food to workers walking past on their way to the nearby rail yard. Fried chicken, cornbread, sweet potato pie, 20 cents a plate. She does not have a food service permit. She does not have a business license. She does not have a health inspection certificate or a zoning variance or liability insurance. She has a stove, a table, and the best fried chicken anyone on that block has ever eaten. Clara is not unusual. During the Depression, unlicensed informal businesses operate on nearly every block of every working-class neighborhood in America. A woman takes in sewing without registering as a tailor. A man repairs shoes from his front porch without a business license. A teenager cuts hair in a kitchen for 50 cents without a cosmetology certificate. The entire informal economy runs on trust, reputation, and necessity, not government permission. The regulatory infrastructure that requires licenses, permits, and inspections for virtually every commercial activity simply does not exist at the local level in most of Depression-era America. Where it does exist, enforcement is minimal because local governments have neither the resources nor the appetite to shut down people who are simply trying to survive. Today, operating a food business from your home without a permit, license, health inspection, and zoning approval is illegal in every state. The requirements vary, but the principle is consistent. You cannot sell food to the public from a residential property without government authorization. In 1933, a 12-year-old boy named Thomas Garrett works 12 hours a day in his family's coal yard in Pittsburgh, shoveling coal into bags and delivering them by cart to neighboring houses. Thomas is not being exploited. He is keeping his family alive. His father is sick. His mother takes in laundry. Without Thomas working, the coal yard closes and the family has no income. Under federal law, in 1933, a 12-year-old working in his father's business faces no federal restriction. The Fair Labor Standards Act, which establishes comprehensive federal child labor protections, does not pass until 1938. Some states have their own child labor laws by this point, but federal enforcement is minimal, and family businesses operate in a practical gray zone where children working alongside parents is accepted as economic necessity rather than exploitation. The work is hard and the hours are long. But in a Depression-era economy where adult employment is scarce and family survival depends on every able-bodied member contributing, a child's labor is not a luxury. It is a necessity that federal law does not yet prohibit and that the community does not condemn. Today, federal child labor laws prohibit children under 14 from working in most non-agricultural settings and restrict the hours and types of work permitted for children 14 to 15. A 12-year-old working 12-hour days in a commercial operation, even a family-owned one, violates federal law and carries significant penalties for the employer, including, in some circumstances, the child's own parents. In 1935, a farmer named James Pruitt outside of Memphis, Tennessee, slaughters hogs in his backyard every fall and sells the meat directly to neighbors at prices well below what the local butcher charges. He does this without USDA inspection, without a licensed slaughterhouse facility, without refrigerated storage, and without any government oversight of any kind. His neighbors line up for it anyway. The pork is fresh, the price is fair, and James has been slaughtering hogs the same way his father taught him for 30 years. The meat does not kill anyone. It feeds families through the winter, at a time when feeding a family through the winter is genuinely difficult. Informal meat production and direct sale operate throughout rural and working-class urban America during the Depression. The regulatory framework for meat inspection exists at the federal level by the 1930s, but enforcement at the local residential level is minimal to non-existent. A man slaughtering animals on his own property and selling the meat to people he knows personally is operating in a regulatory gray zone that most local authorities have neither the resources nor the motivation to police. Today, selling meat to the public requires USDA inspection of the slaughter facility, federal or state certification of the processing operation, and compliance with a complex set of food safety regulations that make backyard hog slaughtering for commercial sale impossible in virtually every jurisdiction in the country. Number 14, unregulated home dentistry and medicine. In 1932, a man named Walter Hicks in rural Mississippi has a pair of pliers, a bottle of whiskey, and 30 years of experience pulling teeth. He is not a dentist. He has never attended dental school, passed a licensing examination, or obtained any form of professional certification. He is simply the man in the county who pulls teeth because the nearest actual dentist is 40 miles away and charges more than most families earn in a month. Walter charges 50 cents. He uses the whiskey both as an antiseptic and as an anesthetic. His patients do not always have good outcomes, but they have outcomes, which is more than they would have if they waited for a licensed professional who they cannot afford and cannot easily reach. Home medicine operates on a similar basis throughout Depression-era America. Women who function as midwives, herbalists, and informal medical practitioners serve communities where professional health care is inaccessible and unaffordable. Men with some knowledge of anatomy and wound care treat injuries that would today require emergency room visits. The entire informal healthcare system runs on necessity, community trust, and the absence of any realistic alternative. Today, practicing dentistry without a license is a criminal offense in every state, carrying penalties including fines and imprisonment. Number 13, squatting on abandoned land. In 1934, a family named the Kowalskis moved into an abandoned farmhouse outside of Detroit that had sat empty for 3 years after the bank foreclosed on it and failed to sell it. They did not have permission from the bank. They did not have a lease. They simply moved in, fixed the broken windows, repaired the roof, planted a garden in the back, and began living there as if it was their home. The bank knew they were there. Local law enforcement knew they were there. Nobody removed them for 2 years. Squatting on abandoned and foreclosed property was widespread during the Depression. The banking system had foreclosed on more properties than it could manage, process, or sell. Empty houses deteriorated, attracted crime, and destabilized neighborhoods. A family willing to maintain a property and live in it quietly was, from the perspective of many local authorities, preferable to an empty building. Formal eviction proceedings cost money that banks and municipalities did not have. Looking the other way cost nothing. The Kowalskis eventually left voluntarily when they found legitimate housing. They never paid rent. They never faced legal action. They spent 2 years living in a house that technically belonged to a bank that could not be bothered to remove them. Today, squatting on private property is illegal in every state and subject to civil and criminal penalties. Property owners have legal mechanisms to remove squatters quickly in most jurisdictions. The informal tolerance that Depression-era banks and local governments extended to families occupying abandoned properties does not exist in the modern legal framework. Every entry on this list so far has one thing in common. The law either did not exist yet, was not enforced, or was simply ignored by people who had no other choice. What follows is different. These are not just survival tactics. These are ways ordinary Americans built income, built businesses, and built lives, all of which would bring serious legal consequences today. In 1931, a Greek immigrant named Stavros Dimitriou sets up a food cart on a corner in Chicago's Loop District without a permit, without a health inspection, and without any authorization from the city. He sells hot dogs, roasted nuts, and coffee from 5 in the morning until the lunch crowd thins out. He has been doing this for 3 years. The city has issued him 2 citations, both of which he has ignored. Nobody has shut him down. Street vending without permits operates throughout Depression-era American cities on a scale that modern city governments would find unimaginable. The permit systems exist in theory. In practice, enforcement is inconsistent, corruption is common, and the sheer volume of informal vendors on city streets makes comprehensive enforcement impossible. A vendor who builds relationships with the beat cop on his corner, tips generously at Christmas, and keeps his area clean generally operates without interference. The informal street economy feeds both the vendors and their customers. A worker who cannot afford a restaurant lunch can eat for 15 cents from a street cart. A vendor who cannot afford restaurant rent can earn a living from a cart on a corner. The system works because it is efficient and because nobody with the authority to stop it has a strong incentive to do so. Today, street vending without a permit is illegal in every major American city. Permit systems are complex, expensive, and in many cities, so restricted that legal vending spots are essentially unavailable to new entrants. In 1932, a man named Roosevelt Brown runs a numbers operation out of a barbershop in Harlem. Every morning, customers place bets of as little as a penny on a 3-digit number. If their number hits, they collect at odds of 600 to 1. Roosevelt collects the bets, pays the winners, and keeps the difference. He employs 6 runners who collect bets from customers who cannot come to the shop. He earns more in a week than most Harlem residents earn in a month. The numbers game is the primary financial institution of many Depression-era Black communities. Banks will not serve them. Insurance companies will not cover them. The formal economy excludes them at almost every level. The numbers operation provides something the formal economy does not, a chance, however small, at a meaningful payout, combined with a community banking function where Roosevelt extends informal credit to regular customers and functions as a neighborhood financial hub. The operation is illegal. Roosevelt knows this. The police know this. The arrangement is that Roosevelt pays a weekly amount to the precinct and operates without interference. This is not unusual. Numbers operations in Black neighborhoods across America operate under similar arrangements throughout the Depression, providing income, employment, and informal financial services to communities that the formal economy has abandoned. Today, operating an unlicensed gambling business is a federal crime under the Illegal Gambling Business Act, carrying penalties of up to 5 years in prison. The informal community banking function that Depression-era numbers operations served has no modern equivalent that operates outside the law with similar tolerances. In 1933, a Polish steelworker named Stanislaw Wojcik in Gary, Indiana, sends $20 a month back to his family in Krakow through an informal remittance network run out of a neighborhood delicatessen. The remittance is organized by a man named Henrik, who collects cash from Polish workers every Friday, records the amounts in a ledger, and sends consolidated transfers to a contact in Warsaw who distributes the funds to recipient families across Poland. No bank is involved, no wire transfer license exists, no government oversight of any kind monitors the transaction. Henrik takes a 2% fee, and the money arrives in Krakow within 2 weeks, reliably, at an exchange rate significantly better than anything a formal financial institution would offer. Reliably is what makes the system work. Informal remittance networks operate throughout immigrant communities across Depression-era America. Polish, Italian, Greek, Chinese, and Mexican communities all develop their own versions of the same system. A trusted community member who aggregates transfers, finds the best exchange rate available through personal contacts abroad, and delivers the money to recipient families without the overhead, regulation, or fees of a formal banking institution. Trust binds these systems together. The networks handle millions of dollars annually. They are invisible to the federal government, invisible to tax authorities, and invisible to the banking system. They work because the communities that use them have no realistic alternative, and because the trust that holds them together is enforced by social consequence rather than legal contract. Invisible summarizes their reach. Today, operating an informal money transfer business without registration with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network is a federal crime punishable by up to 5 years in prison. The licensing and compliance requirements for legal money transfer operations are significant enough that the informal community networks of the Depression era could not exist legally in the modern regulatory environment. Federal enforcement and strict compliance have reshaped how remittances move. In 1932, a woman named Ida Mae Collins in rural Alabama bottles and sells a tonic she calls Dr. Collins Nerve Tonic from her kitchen. The tonic is a mixture of alcohol, herbs, roots, and minerals that Ida May has refined over 20 years of informal practice. She sells it door to door for 50 cents a bottle, and by word of mouth to families across 3 counties who swear it cures everything from rheumatism to sleeplessness to digestive complaints. She is not a doctor. She has no pharmaceutical training, no chemistry education, and no regulatory approval of any kind. She has a recipe that works well enough that her customers keep buying it, and a network of satisfied customers who refer their neighbors to her. Patent medicine and informal tonic sales are widespread throughout Depression-era America, particularly in rural communities where access to licensed medical care is limited and the cost of a doctor's visit is prohibitive. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which establishes comprehensive federal regulation of drugs and medical claims, does not pass until 1938. In the years before it, selling a homemade tonic with medical claims requires nothing but a bottle, a label, and a customer willing to pay. Some of these tonics are genuinely harmful. Some contain dangerous levels of alcohol, lead, or other toxic ingredients. Many are simply ineffective. But in communities where the alternative is no treatment at all, the tonic seller fills a gap that licensed medicine cannot reach. Today, manufacturing and selling a product with medical claims without FDA approval is a federal crime. The regulatory framework for drug manufacturing is comprehensive, and the penalties for violation are significant. In 1934, a carpenter named Harold Simmons in rural Kentucky builds a barn for his neighbor in exchange for 6 months of fresh eggs, a side of pork, and help harvesting his corn crop in the fall. No money changes hands, no record is kept. Neither man reports anything to any government authority because neither man understands that there is anything to report. The barter economy is enormous during the Depression. Cash is scarce, unemployment is high, and communities that cannot afford to pay each other in money pay each other in labor, goods, and services instead. A doctor treats patients in exchange for firewood. A teacher gives lessons in exchange for vegetables. A mechanic repairs equipment in exchange for a share of the harvest. The entire rural economy runs on informal exchange at a scale that makes the cash economy look like a secondary system. The position of the IRS on barter income, that the fair market value of goods and services received in exchange for labor constitutes taxable income, exists in theory by the 1930s. In practice, enforcement of barter income reporting in rural Depression-era America is essentially non-existent. The IRS has neither the capacity nor the political will to pursue farmers and tradesmen who swap labor for chickens. Today, barter income is fully taxable and must be reported on federal tax returns at fair market value. The IRS actively pursues unreported barter income, and penalties for failure to report can be significant. In 1933, a hunter named Calvin Doss in the Ozark Mountains of Missouri traps rabbits, squirrels, and deer throughout the fall and winter and sells the meat directly to families in his community for cash. Calvin does not have a hunting license. He does not have a trapping license. He does not have a food handler's permit. He has a rifle, a trap line, and a skill set that has fed his family and his neighbors for 30 years. Game laws exist in Missouri by 1933, but enforcement in rural areas is minimal. The state game warden covers an enormous territory with minimal resources and spends most of his time on commercial poaching operations rather than on subsistence hunters selling meat to neighbors. A man like Calvin, who is known in his community, who does not take more than the population can sustain, and who sells only locally, operates in a practical gray zone that enforcement authorities largely ignore. The meat Calvin sells is fresh, locally harvested, and cheaper than anything available in a store. In communities where cash for food is scarce, a hunter willing to sell game meat at reasonable prices is providing a service that the formal food system cannot replicate. Today, selling wild game meat to the public is illegal in every state. Federal law prohibits the commercial sale of most wild game, and state laws add additional restrictions on hunting and trapping without licenses. In 1932, a coal miner named Frank Bellucci in rural Pennsylvania pays a neighboring farmer $300 cash for a 2-acre parcel of land. The transaction is recorded on a handwritten receipt signed by both parties and witnessed by a neighbor. There is no title search, there is no title insurance, there is no lawyer involved, there is no formal deed recorded with the county in the immediate term. Frank builds a small house on the land and begins farming it. The informal land transaction is common throughout Depression-era rural America. Formal title processes are expensive, slow, and require access to legal professionals that most working-class families cannot afford. Communities develop their own informal systems for recording and witnessing land transactions, such as handwritten receipts, neighborhood witnesses, and ledger books kept by trusted community members that function as de facto proof of ownership in places where everyone knows everyone. The risks are real. Informally acquired land can be subject to competing claims, undisclosed liens, and title disputes that a formal title search would have revealed. Frank's 2 acres may have debts attached to them that he does not know about. But Frank cannot afford to find out, and the farmer selling the land needs the $300 immediately. The transaction happens on terms both parties can afford. Today, purchasing real property without a formal title search, title insurance, and a recorded deed exposes the buyer to risks that modern real estate law is specifically designed to prevent. Most mortgage lenders require title insurance as a condition of financing. The informal land transaction of the Depression era is not illegal today, but it is practically impossible to execute safely in the modern legal and financial environment. In 1935, a Greek restaurant owner named Nicholas Papadopoulos in Akron, Ohio, lent money to members of his community. He negotiated interest rates privately with each borrower, kept his loan records in a private ledger, collected payments in cash, and charged interest that was significantly higher than what a bank would charge. Banks would not lend to his customers at any rate. Nicholas was the only available source of credit for the Greek families in his neighborhood who needed capital to start businesses, cover medical emergencies, or weather periods of unemployment. Nicholas was operating what was legally an unlicensed lending business. He had no banking charter, no state lending license, and no regulatory oversight of any kind. The regulatory framework for consumer lending that would make his operation clearly illegal did not fully exist yet in 1935. State usury laws varied widely, and enforcement of unlicensed lending in immigrant communities was minimal to non-existent. The community lending function that Nicholas provided was essential. Without him, the Greek families in his neighborhood had no access to credit. With him, businesses got started, families survived medical emergencies and periods of unemployment, and the community built economic resilience that the formal banking system was not willing to provide. Today, operating a consumer lending business without a state license is illegal in every state. Usury laws cap interest rates and lending disclosure requirements are comprehensive. In 1933, a retired school teacher named Margaret Evers in rural Georgia charges 25 cents a week to teach reading, writing, arithmetic, and basic history to 12 children whose families cannot afford the fees at the local private school and whose nearest public school is 8 miles away and does not accept black students. Margaret has taught for 20 years in the public system. She knows exactly what she is doing. She simply does not have permission to do it privately. Informal education operates throughout Depression-era America wherever the formal school system fails to reach. Rural communities too small to support a public school, segregated communities denied access to white public schools, and immigrant communities whose children need instruction in English all develop informal teaching arrangements where knowledgeable adults charge small fees to educate children the system has left behind. Regulatory frameworks for private schooling and educational certification vary widely by state in the 1930s. In many states, the requirements for operating a private school or tutoring for pay are minimal or unenforced at the informal community level. Margaret's Kitchen School operates without interference because local authorities have neither the mandate nor the motivation to shut down a woman teaching children to read. Today, operating a private school requires state approval in most jurisdictions, and private tutoring businesses face varying but increasingly comprehensive regulatory requirements depending on the state. The informal kitchen school of the Depression era occupies a legal gray zone that has narrowed significantly over the decades. 1932, a man named Samuel Chen in San Francisco's Chinatown operated an unlicensed herbal medicine dispensary out of a single room. He dispensed traditional Chinese remedies to the community without a pharmacy license, without a pharmacist certification, and without any government oversight of what he sold or how he sold it. Samuel had studied traditional Chinese medicine for 30 years. His remedies were the primary health care available to a community that could not afford American doctors and that was not always welcome in American medical facilities. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, that would bring comprehensive federal regulation to pharmaceutical dispensing, did not pass until 1938. Before that, the regulatory environment for selling herbal and traditional remedies was significantly more permissive than it later became. Samuel's dispensary operated in a gray zone between food, medicine, and cultural practice that regulators had not yet clearly defined. The community Samuel served had no realistic alternative. His dispensary was the healthcare system for hundreds of families who would otherwise go without treatment entirely. The remedies he dispensed had been refined over centuries of practice. Some were effective, some were not. But they were available, affordable, and provided by someone the community trusted. Today, operating a pharmacy without a license is a criminal offense in every state. The regulatory framework for pharmaceutical dispensing is comprehensive and it is strictly enforced. In 1934, a carpenter named Joe Marcello in New Jersey builds a 2-room addition onto his house over the course of 3 weekends using lumber he salvages from a demolished building down the street. He does not apply for a building permit. He does not submit plans for inspection. He does not have the work reviewed by a licensed contractor or a building inspector. He simply builds the addition because his family needs the space and he knows how to build. Building permit requirements exist in many American municipalities by the 1930s, but enforcement at the residential level is minimal. Local building departments are underfunded, understaffed, and focused on commercial construction rather than the backyard additions and informal structures that working-class families build to accommodate growing families and economic necessity. The addition Joe builds is structurally sound. He has been a carpenter for 20 years. He knows what he is doing. The absence of a permit does not make the addition dangerous. It simply makes it unofficial. His neighbors build similar additions. The neighborhood fills with informal structures that house families who cannot afford to move to larger homes and cannot afford the cost and delay of the formal permitting process. Today, building a structure without a permit is illegal in virtually every jurisdiction in the United States, and it carries fines, mandatory removal orders, and complications when selling the property. The permitting process exists to ensure structural safety and zoning compliance. Number 1, operating a business under a false name to avoid creditors, running a business under a family name. In 1933, a hardware store owner named Arthur Whitfield in Cleveland, Ohio, closes his business after accumulating debts he cannot repay. He owes money to suppliers, to a bank, and to several private creditors. 6 months later, a new hardware store opens 3 blocks away under the name Whitfield & Sons. The owner is Arthur's wife, Mildred. The inventory is the same. The location is different. Arthur works behind the counter 6 days a week as an employee. The creditors know exactly what is happening. The bank knows exactly what is happening. Nobody has the resources or the legal mechanisms to stop it effectively. Bankruptcy law in 1933 does not provide the comprehensive creditor protections that modern bankruptcy law offers, and the informal small business economy operates on personal relationships and reputation as much as legal enforcement. Mildred has never borrowed money in her name. She owes nobody anything. The new business is hers legally. Arthur is her employee. The debts he accumulated belong to a business that no longer exists. This is not considered particularly shameful in a Depression-era business community where the alternative to creative restructuring is destitution. Creditors who push too hard lose everything. Creditors who accept the new arrangement at least have a functioning business in the neighborhood that might eventually pay something back. Everyone understands the arrangement. Today, fraudulent transfer of assets to avoid creditors is a federal crime under bankruptcy fraud statutes and a civil violation under the Uniform Fraudulent Transfer Act adopted by most states. The legal mechanisms available to creditors to pierce informal business restructurings are comprehensive. Arthur and Mildred's arrangement would expose both of them to significant legal liability today. In 1933, it was simply how a man kept his family fed when the economy had taken everything else. These were not 19 separate crimes waiting to happen. They were 19 ways that ordinary Americans refused to stop moving when the country stopped working. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe. Watch the next video above.